just asked me if I was. Yeah, I am. So you need to picture this. I am a 24-year-old know-it-all young theologian in my first full-time job as the youth and family minister of First Christian Church in Huntington Beach, California. This is a true story. I had spent the previous 6 or 7 years in kind of training to be a youth pastor. I'd been at another church for about 5 years, kind of underneath the mentoring of a guy, and I felt like I had a high degree of confidence. I'm 24. I know everything, and it just comes with the territory, and so I take this job, and my job is to oversee middle school, high school, and college. That's what I did. The church, I don't know, at that time is about 1,000 people. So it was a pretty big church, and I thought I had arrived. I had yet to learn the true lessons of forced humility in the role of a minister. Happens in any occupation, I think. But anyway, I had a great deal of confidence, especially in youth ministry, even at that age, and was there about 3 months, and we lost one of our pastors. I quit or something, I don't know. And there were 7 of us on our staff, and the senior leader looks at me and goes, do you have youth leaders in middle school, high school, and college on Sunday mornings that can handle Sunday school? And I said, yeah, I inherited a great team. I said, yeah, they've got it. And he goes, I want you to fill in and teach this adult class. Well, I look at it and I go, I can do that. They're just adults. And so I step in. Well, it's a class of maybe the most seasoned believers at this church. It had some elders in the group. It had Bible college graduates, a couple of former pastors, a retired guy that, I don't know, I think he could quote the whole Bible. And it didn't register with me that why don't you get one of them to teach the class? I have no idea. But he says, you can teach whatever you want. Well, how long am I going to need to do this? And he goes, well, less than a year. Okay, less than a year. Okay, I can do this. So I go into this class, and it's, it's this entire center section full of adults and kind of bleeding over to the side. And I had made the decision, because I was personally studying this at that time, we're just going to go through the Sermon on the Mount together. Well, Sermon on the Mount, I have had a passionate love of studying that my whole life. But I had really just started my lifelong study of the Sermon on the Mount. And I thought I could do this. I really did. I thought I could teach what the master teacher had taught. without having walked any part. Let me look on your phone and tell me how long this lasts. Okay, I'm going to talk louder. Anyway, I start into this, teaching this with a high degree of confidence. I mean, Sermon on the Mount, if you know, it starts with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the this, for they will have this. How hard can this be? And the more I taught, the deeper in the quagmire of theology I was sinking, because the people in that class, they were adults. They had spent many more years, a lot of them, many more years studying the Sermon on the Mount than I had, and had come to their own conclusions. And I asked for comments. I asked questions and said, what do you all think about this? And I am getting this massive dose of where people were at and what they believed about this most meaningful passage of Scripture in the Bible. And by the time I was done in my 9 months, I had realized that I was probably going to need to spend the rest of my life studying the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm not joking when I say that. It has been a life journey for me, because it's in the Sermon on the Mount that we get the most concise explanation of the heart and theology of our King. Now, it's not the only place that he speaks, and we have to look at other things. We must take and measure the things that Jesus says against the things that are in the letters in the New Testament. Paul and Peter, James, you put them up side by side. But I have always believed that we start with the words of Jesus and we take the rest of it and make sure it coincides with what he says. That's where I landed after that, after the humiliation of teaching this class as a young man. We are starting the month of June. I'm going to be back here. Kyle did last month, and I think he did a really good job on what he was teaching, and we're trying to begin sharing the responsibilities more and more here, but I get this month. And so we're going to look this month at some lessons in obedience. My definition of obedience is, to the best of my knowledge, is this thing that I'm going to do in accordance with what Jesus has said? Is this thing that I am going to do reflective of the writings of the apostles as recorded in the Bible? And do I understand them enough to be able to do them? That's my definition of obedience. And I'm going to share some of my personal lessons in obedience, things that I have learned along the way. The very end of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount appears in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the book of Matthew, and there is another version of it that appears in the book of Luke. It's a little shorter. But the one in Matthew is the most complete one. And in the Sermon on the Mount are some of the most famous and well-known verses in the Bible. There's a whole section of it that has challenged the thinking and theology of Bible scholars throughout the ages, when Jesus says to the Jews that were part of his audience, and over on the side, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, the scholars of Jewish theology, and he turns to them in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount. You have said, or you have heard, and he fills it in. He fills in some form of teaching that they have carried around for hundreds of years, that they believe they had gotten from God, which I believe they had. And he says, you have heard that it was said, or you have heard that it was written. But I tell you, and he has this, what appears to be the exact opposite. And so you're thrown in right from the beginning with stuff that you've got to think through carefully and listen carefully to. That's in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount is the place where the Lord's Prayer is recorded. That's where it was said, and he says, this is how you should pray. Well, you get to the very end of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7, and the very last words are not what Jesus said, but what was said about what was said. And these two verses, let's put them up there, Larry. This is how the Sermon on the Mount concludes, after it concludes. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. Okay? Now that is said specifically in this setting because as Jesus was teaching, I don't know how this all works. It's always one of my questions. Was Jesus up on the mount and teaching down, because it's called Sermon on the Mount, or was he at the base of the mount and all the people were up, kind of like an amphitheater? That's how I picture it. I picture him being down here, and there's this whole crowd of people within hearing distance, hundreds. But over here on this side, I picture through the entire sermon, and I don't believe that everything that Jesus said in his sermon is recorded in the Sermon on the Mount. There's just got to be more explanation and more other stuff in there. That's just my opinion. But through the whole part of it, I picture this crowd, maybe 15 or 20 guys in their robes with the things around their waist and their little bags and their little things that they carried around. And they were the teachers of the law. And they have stood there the entire time listening to Jesus say, these guys have said, but I say to you. And so it's packed with emotion, the whole setting of the Sermon on the Mount. And out of this, the end of it, we read that he didn't teach the way that they did. He taught as one who had authority, like real authority, like God authority. And that was at the very, very beginning of his ministry after he had left his home and went out. And I think, this is just my speculation, I think it was right at this time that the murmuring among the teachers of the law began and said, we've got to get rid of this guy. He's a threat. Right there, in this most wonderful sermon that is preached, I think they were starting to stir at that time and said, we've got to get rid of him. Anyway, that's the end of it. So everything that Jesus said, now I think it's everything, but in the Sermon on the Mount in particular, everything that Jesus said was counterculture. It was not the flow of the culture. It did not represent the values of the power of the Roman Empire. It stood in opposition. The words that he said were counter to the teachings of the Jewish leaders. And I just want to ask you to consider the idea that Jesus was, in the midst of all of his wonderful, loving words, Jesus was a threat. He was a threat to everything that those two groups, the Roman Empire and the Jewish teachers of the law, what they stood for was threatening. And certainly the threat to the Jewish leaders is that they were going to have to face immediately that as soon after that he was going to say that he was God. And you don't mess with God. If you're Jewish, if you come out of that heritage, you don't mess with God. And right off the bat, he is teaching with godly authority. And they were listening to it. So what makes the words and teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, to me, so radical, so revolutionary, so uncompromising? So let's take one more small step backwards from this right here and see how Jesus actually concludes the Sermon on the Mount. Let's look at the way that he weaves together this epic ending to all of these things that he has just taught about. This is it. It's verses 24 and 25. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who has built his house on the rock. The rain came down. How appropriate. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Now, you know the story. This is, if you spend any time at church, as a child, you sang, "The rains came down and the floods came." You remember that one, okay? Now, if you fast forward from when we were children to when, 25 or 30 years after that, the song that we sang in youth group was, and I am a poor singer, but does anybody who was part of our youth group back then remember, don't build your house on the sandy land, don't build your house too near the shore. Well, it might look kind of nice, but you'll have to build it twice. Yes, you'll have to build your house once more. That was how we sang that verse. And then there was an accompanying verse that the guys would sing that and the girls would sing their part. It was completely different and we would put it together. I miss those days of singing like that. It was important. We learned a lot about our faith through this teaching and that song. Look, there are two kinds of people. Now, you can say this about so many different things. And so in my thinking related to this passage, there's two kinds of people. Those who are going through a crisis and those that are about to. That covers everybody. Those who are going through one at the moment and those who are about to. And they don't know exactly when, but they know it's going to happen. So I'm going to ask you today for the next 15 minutes or so, I want you to decide which one you are. Are you going through the crisis right now? Are you in the storm? Or are you sitting just outside the storm going, wonder when it's going to happen? Two kinds of people. It's funny, but most people really don't know much about the foundation of a house. I moved here 30 years ago. I knew absolutely nothing about the dirt in Texas. I had come from California. We never, in San Diego, we never talked about the foundation. We never talked about having to put in pillars underneath the concrete. In fact, most of us didn't have a slab anyway. They built on pier and beam. But the ground there doesn't shift unless there's a massive earthquake. And then what are you going to do about that? But I come here, nobody tells me. Well, you need to check the history of the house and look at the history of the foundation. See how many times they have had to jack that thing up and fill in holes and make it level again. You need to ask the owners, do the windows work right? Ask the owner that you're buying it from, how do the doors, work all year long? Some of you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. I didn't ask those questions. I walk into the house, we fall in love with the house, we're buying this thing. Only to find out later that there were a number of problems. A number of problems. But most people don't even think about the foundation, unless you live here, but foundation because it's underground. What you see can't hurt you. What you don't see can't hurt you. It's underground. It's hidden. And you never really think about the foundation unless there is something wrong above ground, right? So here's the lesson coming. You know what the lesson is, don't you? You know why he's teaching this. It's for everyone, and it's for all time. The wise man is the one who hears the words of Jesus and puts them into practice. I'll say it again. The wise man is the one who hears the words of Jesus and puts them into practice. Hearing and doing what Jesus says is the foundation of a wise man or a wise woman. Don't miss this. People act like the foundation we build on as Christians, they act like the foundation is truth. That makes sense. It's your foundation, truth. Can't do anything without knowing the truth. And I believe that truth is important, really important. But the problem is, it's not the foundation. It's not the foundation of a life of following Jesus. That's not what he is saying. A good foundation is the discipline of doing what the truth says, of doing what Jesus says. Wise people hear and obey the master. And when we hear and obey, we can have a strong foundation that will withstand the storms. Look, people who hear and do what Jesus says have the same crises as people who don't. Crisis is common to everybody. Storms are common to everybody. Waves crashing metaphorically into our lives to wipe us out is something that happens to everybody. It's part of life. Obedience to Christ does not mean you won't have storms. You will. Just like everyone else, the storms will slam you. Obedience to the words of Jesus, obedience to the truth revealed in the Bible, is not protection from the storms. In other words, just knowing stuff. Anybody, and you got to picture this, anybody can build a house that will stand firm in sunny weather and no storms? Well, not anybody, but you can build a great solid house when you got great weather and great ground. I spent my early summers working for my father, who was a superintendent in a really large construction company. And I was the boss's son. Not always a good thing, but especially when everybody on the work site knows that you're the boss's son. I spent a ton of time shoveling and pouring concrete. The company that my dad worked for was a commercial company, so he built shopping centers. Do you know how much cement is poured in a shopping center? And every day, all summer, I would show up and pull on my rubber boots up to my knees and go hang out with my Hispanic brothers, who are the most incredible cement workers on the face of the earth. I knew nothing. They knew that I knew nothing. And they played jokes on me all day long of what I needed to do. That was my life in the summers. But let me tell you, I learned a lot about concrete and a lot about foundations. And one thing that I learned is that you cannot pour concrete in a storm. So you may know what happens if you pour concrete when it's raining really hard? It makes the cement weak. And it won't set up right, and it will make it prone to crack. So as soon as the water would start to come out, from the clouds, which didn't happen a lot in Southern California, but when it did, everybody was, man, we were beating it over to the food truck, trying to wait this thing out. But I learned you don't build a foundation in the storm, because if you do that, it's too late. Look at how this next part goes in 26 and 27. It goes, however, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Mic drop. Those are his last words. Not in Jesus' name, amen. Not in, let's pray for everybody here. The house fell with a great crash. I love the ending. Raise your hand boldly if you floss your teeth every day. A third? Okay. Raise your hand if you know you should floss your teeth every day. Okay, so nobody's ignorant of that truth. We know that we are supposed to. Why don't we floss our teeth every day when we know we should? We know the charts. You may even have a fancy floss holder at home that you bought. You may even have made the commitment. This year, I'm going to floss every day. I am sick and tired of paying high bills to the dentist simply because I'm not flossing my teeth. This year, I'm going to do it. Nah. After a week, you stop. You know why you stop? Because you don't really believe that your teeth will rot and fall out. It don't want to happen to me. It does. In the same way, you can hear all of Jesus' words and even know them. You You could pass a test to become a member of a church, a theology test. You've got the answers. But Jesus says if you just have a big head full of knowledge and you don't do what is said, well, what's the point? Might as well listen to TikToks all day. The decision not to act on Jesus' words, get this, the decision not to act on the king's words is a decision to act on somebody else's words. There's no neutral ground in this. Somebody, somewhere, is speaking into your life, convincing you to do this or that. You have had people say to you, a decision to do nothing is still a decision that you have arrived at by listening to truth or some kind of truth somewhere else. Don't kid yourself. Every person here is building on some kind of foundation. You plan some scheme, some design, but don't be a fool. You've got a foundation, but it may be a bad one. Why did the foolish man build in the sand? What made him foolish about that? He miscalculated the weather. He didn't take it into account. He built when it was all sunshine and easy, and he didn't anticipate changes. He didn't anticipate the storms would come. They have already come again in your life, and they will come again. Dealing with a difficult or broken relationship, going through financial crisis, withstanding legal problems, unpleasant or painful health problems, the death of somebody you love, dealing with rebellious children, facing something that brought public disgrace, being laid off from work, dealing with conflict. I could go on and on. You could add yours in. I've seen those storms devastate people in their lives. Lost relationships, lost confidence, lost joy, even losing faith. But these words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount at the very end teach us that it doesn't have to be that way. We would take people from North Point for years and years going down into Mexico, building houses for the poor down there. Well, I have such great memories of pouring cement because we would mix it by hand, a whole foundation, 11 foot by 22 feet, and kids would be out there working and shoveling sand and mixing it by hand. There's no power, no mixer, no anything. Well, I will tell you, and then you have to set the forms. When you walk up there on the first day and you come up to this empty site where you're going to build a house and the ground is all sand, there was leaping and joy in the streets. Kids going, we don't have to spend half the day in the sun leveling this thing. It's just sand. You just sort of move it around, and it was great. It was easy, but it doesn't last. Building on rock, on hard rock, is tough work. It takes time and energy. It costs more, but it's secure and it lasts. Building on the sand in our lives is cheap and easy. It's faster. You can take shortcuts. It looks good, but it'll crack under pressure. Somewhere along the line, if you don't have the right foundation, you will pay dearly for your workmanship. Because someday, sometime, it will fall with a great crash. Same is true in our lives. It takes less time and less energy to build a superficial faith. Who can tell the difference? We tell ourselves. Because in the end, when it starts to crash, you can cry in desperation and start bargaining with God. But it takes work to develop a faith that will stand up in the storm on its own. The foundation that will last is a faith that has grown strong and resilient through the discipline of doing the words of Jesus. There is no substitute. There is no fix-it. This was my greatest lesson from the Sermon on the Mount, because I always thought growing up that the foundation was all the truth that I was taught. You got to have a good you got to know the right stuff to have a good foundation. And Jesus said, don't miss this. Having the stuff in your head, having the stuff in your heart is not the foundation. Doing it is the foundation. Those who follow in obedience are the ones who have a strong foundation. Jesus is the King. His words are wise and true. My question today for you is a simple one. What are you doing? What are you doing with his words? They're right there. Are you storing them up inside so that you can win arguments, tell people they're wrong, or check a box that says, yeah, I know all the right stuff? Or do you follow and obey? On this, there is no middle ground. There's no middle ground on having a firm foundation. I love that it's clear. I used to sing a song in my home church. I can still remember it. It's one of those hymns. Remember Trust and Obey? Yeah, some of us that are older, we remember that one. I remember all 4 verses. They're just right there. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. Little did I know when I was young how true that was. I didn't understand that. I think I'm getting there. Hope you are too. We're going to have communion together. Look at that crowd getting up to serve. Okay? There we go. And let me tell you, communion is pretty easy today.